You're watching Light Behind Bars, where real crime meets powerful redemption. Every story here is inspired by true events brought to life through deep emotion and fiction. If you're ready to explore the human side of justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. Beneath the vast Canadian sky, where the hues of everyday life are woven with peace and order, there lived a man named Bruce MacArthur. On the surface, Bruce was a picture of stability, a familiar piece in the community's puzzle. His easy smile and neighborly demeanor made him the kind of person you might nod to at the grocery store, passing by without the slightest inkling of the dark depths hidden within. By daylight, his face glowed with familiar lines, masking the hairline fractures of a soul slowly rotting from the inside. But darkness, like a poisonous vine, had taken root long ago, creeping through his very being, threading through every thought, waiting to bloom into something warped and horrifying. Bruce's childhood, through the lens of those around him, seemed as ordinary as any other. Those early years were cloaked in the haze of memory, unremarkable enough to offer no hint of the monster growing within. Perhaps there were signs, sudden flashes of suppressed anger, distant gazes that defied understanding, or moments of solitude no one could truly penetrate. But children are complex, and such things are easily dismissed, like wandering clouds on a summer sky. People see what they want to see, and in the form of a young boy. Few could imagine the seeds of cruelty taking root. The facade of innocence, of normalcy, was built early, thick, and sturdy, enough to conceal the first stirrings of a troubled soul. It was the first mask, crafted unconsciously, yet fitting with terrifying precision. As Bruce grew into adulthood, that mask became ever more refined. He married, built a family. Their home rang with children's laughter, warmed by cozy dinners and summer vacations captured in photos where everyone smiled happily. Bruce was a husband, a father. He played his role flawlessly, fulfilling society's expectations, perhaps even longing to believe it was his true self. He worked, provided for his family, engaged in community activities. No one could fault this man. The light of family life, of responsibility, seemed to wash away any trace of shadow or doubt. But it was all an illusion. Beneath that seemingly serene surface, dark undercurrents churned relentlessly. In the dead of night, when his wife and children slept, Bruce lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the room grew thick, suffocating. Thoughts he dared not name, desires he buried deep, began to rise, clawing at his core. He felt like a stranger in his own life, an actor trapped in a play he didn't love. The inner conflict emerged not in screams, but in heavy silences, in sighs that lingered in the dark, in fleeting glances, heavy with unnamed sorrow. He tried to drown them out, burying himself in work and routine. But those thoughts were like tree roots. Each attempt to uproot them only drove them deeper into the barren soil of his soul. He learned to hide. His smile might not reach his eyes, but who would notice? His words might ring hollow, but who would care to dig deeper? The world runs on surface conventions, and Bruce was a master at upholding them. He knew how to say what people wanted to hear, do what they approved of. The mask of kindness, of normalcy, grew ever more perfect. It fooled not only those around him, but, at times, even himself. In fleeting moments, he almost believed he was the man he pretended to be. Yet those moments passed, and the darkness returned, more persistent, more powerful. The divide between the man he presented to the world and the man he truly was widened, light and shadow. Two seemingly irreconcilable forces coexisted within him, creating unbearable tension. By day, he was the family man, the diligent gardener, the friendly neighbor. But at night, or in unwitnessed moments of solitude, another Bruce emerged, one with twisted desires, warped thoughts, and a terrifying emptiness in his soul. The first cracks were likely invisible, too subtle, too delicate, like fissures in an old wall. They only became apparent under immense pressure, and that pressure, though not yet fully formed, was slowly building, waiting to shatter everything. The perfect mask Bruce MacArthur had so carefully crafted through his youth and family life, no matter how solid it seemed, could not forever conceal the decay within. For some secrets cannot stay buried, some demons cannot be chained. They wait in silence, biding their time to break free, and that silence, sometimes, is more terrifying than any roar. Time, like an erosive river, gradually wore away the seemingly sturdy embankments of the marriage Bruce MacArthur had so painstakingly built. Family dinners were still served, stories still shared, but the warmth had faded, the laughter grown forced. An invisible chasm widened between Bruce and his wife, not through fiery arguments, but through an ever-thickening silence, a creeping estrangement woven into every glance, every gesture. He was still there, in that house, but his soul had drifted to a distant realm, a place his wife could neither reach nor, perhaps, wish to. The smile on his lips now carried a weary edge, a vague resignation, as if he were bearing the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. That secret, like a malignant tumor, had been silently growing within him since his youth, a secret named homosexuality, in a society where heterosexual norms stood as an unyielding fortress. Acknowledging his true self was a brutal struggle. Bruce had tried to deny it, burying it beneath the veneer of a normal man, a husband, a father. He convinced himself that family life, love for his wife and children, could extinguish the fire of his instincts. But that fire never died. It smoldered, waiting to blaze up and consume everything he had worked to build. The inner conflict became his constant companion. By day, he donned the cloak of propriety. But at night, in solitude, he faced his true self, a self yearning for things society, and perhaps his own conscience shaped by outdated conventions. Condemned, he felt like a criminal, an outcast. The beliefs he had clung to began to waver. If God created man in his image, why had he made Bruce with these deviant desires? Had God abandoned him, or worse? Was there no God at all? Only a cold, indifferent universe unmoved by the torment of one small soul. This betrayal of faith came not from a single event, but from his very existence, from the endless struggle between the man he wanted to be and the man he truly was. His nocturnal outings grew more frequent. He lied to his wife, citing work or friends, to plunge into an underground world where he could briefly shed his heavy mask. Dimly lit bars, shadowed street corners. These were places where kindred souls found fleeting connection. But the relief was temporary, and each return home deepened his guilt and shame. The darkness of those secret encounters clashed starkly with the artificial light of the family life he struggled to maintain. He was a tightrope walker, balancing between two opposing worlds, and the rope grew ever thinner. Then, inevitably, the breaking point came. The marriage, already cracked from within, finally collapsed. Accusations, tears, disappointment. These were the final blows that shattered the facade of happiness. He could no longer hide. This collapse was not just the end of a relationship, but the destruction of a part of himself. The part that had tried to live up to others' expectations. The house was no longer a haven, but a cold, empty space filled with the shards of memories and unspoken reproaches. The faint light of family life had gone out, replaced by a suffocating darkness. The loneliness after the divorce did not quell the storms within Bruce. Instead, it acted as a catalyst, giving the darkest corners of his soul room to rise. Freed from family obligations, from the role of the model husband, he felt both liberated and terrified. This freedom carried a sinister hue, without the moral or emotional anchors to hold him back. His darker desires, his warped thoughts, found fertile ground to grow. His soul, already eroded by torment and deceit, became a wasteland where the weeds of cruelty took root. His dark secrets were no longer just a hidden sexual orientation. They began to take on shades of violence, of control. Perhaps his inability to control his own life, to reconcile his true self with the world, morphed into a perverse desire to control others in the most twisted ways. The emptiness in his soul demanded to be filled, and he sought ever stronger, more dangerous thrills. From fleeting encounters in the shadows, his mind slid into sicker fantasies, where the line between pleasure and pain blurred. The decay of his soul was not sudden. It was a slow process, like a cancer eating away at the body. Every lie, every act of concealment, Every compromise with his conscience brought him closer to the abyss. When his marriage, the final bastion of normalcy, crumbled, nothing remained to halt Bruce MacArthur's descent. He stood at the edge, and the darkness below beckoned, promising a warped release from the torment he had endured for too long. The seed of the monster, sown in his inner turmoil and the collapse of his beliefs, had begun to sprout in the lonely shadows of his existence. In 2001, the dawn of a new century brought promises of progress and change. But for Bruce MacArthur, time only deepened the fissures in his soul. The divorce was behind him, yet its aftershocks lingered, smoldering like an unhealed wound, no longer bound to play the model husband and father in a family that felt like a cage. He found a bitter freedom steeped in loneliness and disorientation, the desires he had once suppressed, now unchained from old constraints, surged with a wild intensity. The void within him demanded to be filled, and the darkness whispered promises of a warped satisfaction, a simmering anger, self-disgust, and perhaps a latent hatred for a world he felt he didn't belong to coalesced into a storm on the verge of breaking. And break it did not in words, but in a raw act of violence. A cold steel strike that heralded a darker chapter in his life. The victim of this sudden rage was a man. The details of what sparked their encounter may have faded with time or been obscured by conflicting accounts. But the outcome was stark and brutal. In a moment of lost control or perhaps a long brewing eruption, Bruce MacArthur swung a metal pipe. The cold, unyielding metal met flesh and bone. The sound of that strike, sharp and chilling, likely seared itself into the minds of both attacker and victim. Blood may have spilled, screams may have echoed, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of kindness Bruce wore fell away, revealing a face of savagery. This was not a calculated murder like those that would follow. It bore the mark of instinctual outburst, a release of pent-up fury. Yet that spontaneity made it all the more terrifying, revealing a latent capacity for violence, a beast ready to break free at any moment. The steel strike didn't just wound its victim. It was a declaration, an acknowledgement of a dark part of Bruce he may have only just begun to fully recognize or accept. The silent struggle between light and shadow within him was no longer confined to his mind. The darkness had found a way to spill into the world, leaving its mark in violence. Legal consequences were inevitable. Bruce MacArthur was arrested, charged with assault. The machinery of justice churned court proceedings, perhaps attempts to justify or downplay his actions, or maybe just silence and acceptance of punishment. Regardless, the incident left an indelible stain on his record, a warning that should have been heeded more carefully. He was convicted, but the penalty likely lacked the weight to fully extinguish the spark of violence that had been ignited. For him, the law's punishment may have been a mere inconvenience, a lesson to hide his impulses more carefully in the future, rather than serving as a turning point for remorse or reform. The 2001 assault seemed to have the opposite effect. It was like a test, an exploration of his own limits. He had touched violence, tasted the power of inflicting pain, and perhaps found a perverse satisfaction in it. A bloody omen had emerged. The victim's blood, though likely washed away, had stained a dark corner of Bruce's soul, awakening the monster within. After serving his sentence, possibly probation or a suspended term, Bruce MacArthur returned to everyday life, striving to rebuild the image of an ordinary citizen. He may have feigned remorse, complied with court conditions. The mask was donned again, perhaps more meticulously, more skillfully than before. But beneath it, a shift had occurred. He now knew what he was capable of. He knew a version of himself existed that could inflict serious harm, and that knowledge, rather than instilling fear of himself, may have planted a seed of twisted confidence. That steel strike was a sign, a warning bell overlooked or underestimated. It was the prelude to a far more horrific symphony to come. The silence that followed was not peace, but the quiet of a predator stalking, learning from its mistakes, waiting for the right moment to strike with greater cruelty and calculation. The darkness had tasted violence and craved more. The cold metal pipe of 2001 was merely the beginning of a chain of acts far colder and more ruthless. The years following the 2001 attack passed in relative silence. At least on the surface, Bruce MacArthur having tasted the consequences of letting his violent impulses erupt unchecked, seemed to have learned his own lessons. He was no longer an amateur at concealing his darker side. The mask of normalcy, of a quiet, harmless, middle-aged man, was crafted with greater care than ever before. He worked as a freelance landscaper, a profession that granted him flexibility in time and space while providing the perfect cover a man who loved plants. Close to nature, how could he possibly be dangerous? The brightness of the gardens he tended, the lushness of the foliage, stood in cruel contrast to the increasingly dense and festering darkness within his soul. The escalation of his crimes was not loud, not a series of explosive outbursts. It was like a metastasizing cancer, silently spreading, corroding from within before the most horrific symptoms surfaced. MacArthur was in no hurry. He had time, the patience of a cunning predator. These years were a period of honing his skills, not those of gardening, but of a potential killer. He learned how to observe, how to select, how to approach, and, most crucially, how to erase his tracks. Toronto's underground gay community became his hunting ground, amid fleeting encounters, unattached relationships, and sometimes the desperation of those seeking connection. MacArthur found vulnerable prey. He wielded his friendly demeanor and the seasoned air of an older man to build trust. He could be a listener, a confidant, a gentle lover in fleeting moments. But it was all an act. Behind those seemingly kind eyes lay cold calculation and a terrifying emptiness. His loss of control was no longer marked by explosive rages, like the pipe attack of years past. Now, it was cloaked in absolute control, a chilling calmness. He planned his encounters, chose his locations, and perhaps began envisioning acts of violence in his mind. The dark fantasies he once tried to suppress were now nurtured, allowed to flourish. The line between imagination and reality grew ever thinner. There may have been smaller incidents, non-lethal acts of violence, threats, or coercion that went unreported or unnoticed. Those victims, if they existed, might have been too frightened or ashamed to speak out. These were his rehearsals. His practice runs for greater crimes. Each successful exercise in control and domination, undetected, fueled his perverse confidence. The beast within him grew bolder, craving stronger thrills. This escalation was also evident in his growing mastery of living a double life. By day, he was Bruce, the gardener, the neighbor. He could smile, chat about the weather or plants. But when night fell, or in the private spaces he created, a different Bruce emerged, a predator, a dominator, the embodiment of violence and cruelty. This duality was not a clinical mental disorder, but a conscious choice, a way to reconcile his dark desires with the demands of blending into society. The darkness in his soul was no longer just thoughts or feelings. It began to materialize, taking the form of tools and plans. He may have started collecting items that would later serve his crimes ropes: duct tape, tools for binding and controlling. These objects, harmless in themselves, became terrifying weapons in the hands of a man with sinister intent. This silent preparation was part of the escalation, revealing an increasingly sophisticated calculation. His true loss of control was not in failing to restrain his impulses, but in fully surrendering to them, finding perverse joy in their indulgence. He no longer fought them. He embraced and nurtured them. He crossed an invisible line in his mind, where empathy for others vanished entirely, replaced by absolute selfishness and a diseased hunger for power. These silent years were a gathering storm. Each passing day brought MacArthur closer to becoming a serial killer. The escalation unfolded in the shadows. Behind the trees, he tended, beneath his false smile, and when the moment was ripe, when the beast within could no longer be restrained by fragile limits, it would pounce on its first victim, unleashing a chain of horrifying nightmares. The silence of these years was the most terrifying kind, for it concealed the rise of a monster. 2010. 7 long years had passed since the pipe attack. 7 years during which Bruce MacArthur submerged himself in his own darkness, nurturing the monster growing within his chest. 7 years of sharpening his predatory skills, cloaking his sinister intentions beneath the guise of a simple gardener. And then, the moment arrived when the darkness could no longer be contained. The beast, now fully formed and brutal, was ready to strike its first fatal blow, transforming Bruce MacArthur from a man with violent potential into a killer. Toronto's vibrant lights and bustling rhythm continued unabated, but in some hidden corner, a life was extinguished, leaving an indelible stain. The first victim, as case files would later reveal, was Skandaraj Navaratnam, a 40-year-old man known as Skanda, a Sri Lankan immigrant. He was a familiar face in Toronto's gay village, described as outgoing and friendly, like many in the community. He was likely searching for connection, love, or simply a moment of warmth in a sprawling city. Fate cruelly placed him in MacArthur's crosshairs. The details of their final encounter, of those horrifying hours, may forever remain locked in MacArthur's mind, buried with him or sealed in the darkest recesses of his memory. But one can imagine a chillingly familiar pattern that would later repeat with other victims. MacArthur, with his trustworthy veneer, likely approached Skanda, perhaps inviting him to his home or another controlled space. There may have been promises, feigned affection, or calculated gestures of intimacy before the demon's true face emerged. In the moment of the crime, everything changed. The facade of gentleness vanished, replaced by raw violence. The light of life in Skanda's eyes faded, consumed by terror, despair, and perhaps an unanswerable question why any cries for help were stifled. Any resistance was futile against a predator who had meticulously planned and was resolute in his intent. Blood was spilled, and this time, it wasn't just a wound, it was death, for any killer. The first murder is a horrific turning point, a line crossed with no return. For MacArthur, it was likely both a release of his pent-up depravity and an affirmation of the absolute power he craved. He had taken a life, controlled another's fate in the most brutal way. That act, however twisted, may have brought him a dark, perverse satisfaction. When Skandaraj Navaratnam vanished in September 2010, his friends and family grew frantic. He wasn't the type to cut off contact abruptly. The police investigated, but initially, his disappearance was treated like many others, no clear signs of foul play, no concrete evidence linking it to MacArthur. The demon had struck discreetly, erasing his tracks with care. His mask remained intact. The first stain was etched not just on MacArthur's hands, but on whatever remained of his soul, if anything could still be called that. Silence shrouded the crime. No screams escaped. No witnesses saw. Only MacArthur and his victim existed in that final moment. For him, that silence was likely part of the triumph. He had done it, and he had not been caught. The battle between light and darkness within him was over. Darkness had won, spilling outward, stained with blood. Each cut, each act of brutality, was a deeper descent into the hell he had crafted for himself. He had become a true predator, and Skandaraj Navaratnam was merely the first in a long line of tragedies to come. Skanda's disappearance sowed unease in the community, but no one could fathom the horrific truth behind it. MacArthur continued his double life. He tended gardens, smiled at neighbors, and went about daily routines. But now, he carried a terrible secret, a burden of guilt that should have crushed anyone with a conscience. Yet MacArthur seemed unburdened or had found a way to deny it, to live with it. The first murder laid the cornerstone of MacArthur's tower of atrocities. It gave him confidence, experience, and perhaps an insatiable addiction to power, to control, to taking lives. From here, his path was one way, plunging into the abyss of cruelty and inhumanity. The blood of Skandaraj Navaratnam marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history. In the years following Skandaraj Navaratnam's death, Bruce MacArthur sank deeper into his double life, a grotesque existence he seemed to have mastered completely. By day, under Toronto's radiant sun, he was Bruce, the diligent gardener, a quirky but harmless figure in the eyes of many. He drove his van, laden with gardening tools, from house to house, trimming trees, tending soil, and crafting beautiful gardens, verdant oases amid the urban sprawl. His hands, once stained with blood, now touched earth and nurtured plant life, a cruel irony, a twisted jest of fate or of his own warped choices. He had clients who entrusted their gardens to him. They might invite him in for tea, chatting about the weather or newly bloomed flowers. He smiled, nodded, offered helpful tips on plant care. None could suspect that this seemingly gentle, almost austere man harbored a horrific secret. The brightness of his gardens, the tranquility of suburban homes, served as the perfect screen for his dark deeds. But when night fell, or in moments unnoticed, another Bruce emerged. This Bruce was no gardener, but a predator. His van, not just a carrier of tools, sometimes became an instrument of crime, a mobile prison, a means to transport what no one should see, the village. The heart of Toronto's LGBTQ+ community remained his primary hunting ground. He frequented bars, used dating apps, and sought new prey, a wolf in sheep's clothing. He blended into the flock, targeting the vulnerable, the lonely, the trusting. This double life demanded meticulous calculation and control. He had to be flawless, leaving no cracks in his facade. Every word, every action was deliberate. He had to remember which role he was playing, where, and with whom. His daytime smile had to be convincing enough to mask the coldness of his nights. His friendliness had to drown out the silent screams of his victims. At times, the line between these two selves likely blurred even in his own mind, or perhaps the true Bruce the Predator had fully taken over, and the gardener was merely a mechanical performance. He might be pruning a rosebush, but his mind was plotting the next deadly encounter. The scent of flowers mingled with the invisible stench of death that only he could sense. More victims followed Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kayhan, men of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, often with complex lives or unstable relationships, whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. MacArthur targeted those he believed would be less likely to be missed, their absences explainable by other means. He was a selective predator, exploiting society's gaps and the system's indifference. The contrast between the gardener nurturing life and the killer extinguishing it is one of the case's most chilling aspects. The planters he tended, the gardens he cultivated, later became hiding places for his crimes, burial grounds for victims' remains. The soil, meant to foster life, became a tomb. Trees, symbols of growth and beauty, stood as silent witnesses to human brutality. Silence continued to cloak his crimes. No one suspected the aging, solitary gardener. He was too ordinary, too harmless, and that was his greatest weapon, while police grappled with disconnected missing persons cases. MacArthur carried on, growing bolder, more ruthless. The darkness wasn't just in his murders, but in the systematic deceit and manipulation he wielded daily. He fooled clients, acquaintances, and perhaps, to some extent, himself, believing he could control the demon within. But that demon was insatiable, growing hungrier with each act. The gardener and the predator, two opposing personas coexisting in one man. Light and darkness fused in a perverse dance, painting a horrifying portrait of Bruce MacArthur. He was proof that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, beneath the most ordinary masks. And sometimes, that ordinariness is the most terrifying thing of all. As the years slipped by, Bruce MacArthur sank deeper into the vortex of his crimes. The tally of his victims grew, and with it, his confidence swelled. Having committed numerous murders without detection, he began to see himself as untouchable, a cunning wolf no one could ensnare. The caution that once guided him gradually gave way to a dangerous complacency, a reckless arrogance. He maintained his facade as a gardener, but beneath the surface, the monster within grew hungrier, craving new hunts and absolute control over the lives of others. Then, a misstep occurred, an incident that disrupted his meticulously crafted plans. In a fleeting moment, MacArthur's smugness was challenged. A scream pierced the frigid night, not just from a victim, but from the creeping fear slithering into the killer's own mind. It was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that even the shrewdest wolf could falter, and luck would not favor him forever. The details of this incident may not be fully documented in public records, or perhaps it was merely a fragment of the larger tapestry of MacArthur's crimes, later pieced together by investigators. But one can imagine it was an encounter that deviated from the script he had so carefully written. Perhaps the potential victim was stronger than he anticipated, more vigilant, or simply luckier than the others. Picture a bone-chilling winter night in Toronto. MacArthur had lured a man to his apartment or some secluded spot he often used. Everything seemed to unfold as usual: honeyed lies, feigned intimacy, And then, when the moment was ripe, he began to reveal his true face. The ropes were likely ready, his familiar tools of torment within reach. But this time, the prey refused to submit. A struggle erupted, furniture crashed, breaths came in gasps, and stifled screams filled the air. The would-be victim, driven by a desperate will to survive, fought back fiercely. Perhaps he seized a fleeting lapse in MacArthur's focus. A split second when the killer underestimated the power of human resilience. And somehow, against all odds, he broke free. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. A door slammed, and cries for help echoed through the silent night. For MacArthur, it was a nightmare. His plan had unraveled. The prey had escaped. Worse still, someone now knew the monster behind the mask, someone who could point the finger at him. Panic surely gripped MacArthur. The man who prided himself on absolute control now found himself cornered. What could he do? Give chase. Too risky. Stay and erase the evidence. But was there time? The wail of police sirens could erupt at any moment. His long-held smugness shattered like a soap bubble, replaced by a primal fear of capture, of exposure, of paying the price for his atrocities. The dim glow of a street lamp spilled into the chaotic room, casting light on MacArthur's ashen face. His breaths were ragged, his heart pounding. He scanned the wreckage, assessing the damage. This wasn't just a failure, it was a warning. He was not invincible. He could make mistakes, and those mistakes could cost him dearly. Perhaps the victim reported him to the police. Perhaps officers arrived, questioning MacArthur. He might have spun a tale, some plausible excuse for the chaos. He could have played the victim himself or an innocent bystander. Once again, his acting skills were called into action. But this time, there was a difference. This time, a living witness had seen the beast behind the mask. Whatever the outcome of that investigation, whether MacArthur slipped through the net or not, the incident undoubtedly left a deep scar on his psyche. It forced him to be more cautious, but it may also have fueled a bitter resolve to succeed in future hunts. That scream in the cold night wasn't just the victim's, it was the sound of MacArthur's false sense of security being torn apart. The near miss likely haunted him for some time. He may have grown paranoid, seeing threats everywhere. Every police siren, every stranger's glance could have made him flinch. The darkness he had woven now seemed to close in on him. Fear, the emotion he so often inflicted on his victims, now gnawed at his core. This incident was a crack in the fortress of crime MacArthur had built, no matter how he tried to patch it. The fissure remained a reminder that collapse was inevitable. The faint light of justice had pierced a corner of his darkness, a harbinger of what was to come after the potential victim's narrow escape. Something shifted in Bruce MacArthur's psyche. The absolute confidence he once wielded had been shaken, giving way to a vague unease, a nameless fear that seeped into every corner of his existence. He continued his gardening work, striving to maintain a calm exterior, but beneath the surface, a new battle had begun. It wasn't just a struggle with whatever remnants of conscience he might still possess. It was a war against the growing certainty that he was being watched. At first, he likely dismissed it as paranoia, a lingering effect of the botched incident. He tried to brush it off, telling himself he was just overstressed, but the feeling clung to him like a shadow, driving through the city. He sensed another car trailing him, in his apartment. Strange noises, whispers he couldn't trace, unsettled him. The glances of passers-by seemed to linger too long, probing too deeply. This sense of being watched wasn't solely rooted in fear of the police. Though he was always wary of law enforcement, he knew his crimes could one day be exposed. But there was something else, an invisible presence, intangible yet undeniable, that he felt with chilling clarity. It might have been the weight of guilt taking shape, or perhaps something more spiritual, a reckoning slowly closing in. On sleepless nights, he lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the door, wondering if the spirits of his victims had returned to haunt him. Faces he'd tried to bury in his memory resurfaced in the darkness, their hollow, accusing eyes boring into him. Their final cries seemed to echo faintly in the air. He tried to banish these visions, but they grew ever more vivid, ever more tormenting. The interplay of light and shadow in his life took on a new meaning. Daylight, once a safe disguise, now left him vulnerable, exposed. He craved the darkness where he could hide. Yet it was in that same darkness that his nameless fears grew stronger. He felt trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither. The belief that something was watching began to shape his behavior. He grew hypervigilant, bordering on paranoid. He scrutinized his vehicle meticulously, changed his routes frequently, and avoided unnecessary contact with others. He might even have turned to superstitious rituals, desperate to ward off the unseen forces pursuing him, but nothing worked. The sense of being watched only deepened. Perhaps this was the start of a spiritual punishment, a judgment not from human courts but from a higher power, or from his own guilty conscience turning inward, no matter how he denied it. His crimes lingered like indelible ink, and that ink was beginning to seep back, poisoning his mind. The silence he once considered an ally now terrified him. In the quiet, he heard the voices within more clearly accusations, warnings, prayer. If he ever knew it, could no longer pass his lips. He knew he was unworthy of being heard, unworthy of forgiveness. This feeling of being watched wasn't mere imagination. It was a reflection of his own sins. He had sown fear and death, and now he was reaping what he had planted. The darkness he created didn't just envelop his victims, it was now swallowing him whole. He was being hunted, not only by the police, but by the demons of his own making. The months that followed were marked by constant tension and dread. He continued his crimes, but the old confidence was gone. Every act was shadowed by the fear of discovery, of exposure. He was like a wounded beast, ferocious, yet terrified. And no matter how he tried to hide, that beast could not escape its own shadow, a shadow growing larger and darker, heralding an inevitable end. Any faint glimmer of remorse, if it ever existed, was snuffed out by his stubbornness and the criminal instincts that had become part of his very being. He was on a one-way path to destruction, and something watching was merely one of the guides on that doomed journey, the chase. At times, seeming almost intangible and tinged with a spiritual hue in Bruce McArthur's mind, finally reached its flesh and blood conclusion, the net of justice. Though it appeared loose at times, ultimately tightened. On January 18, 2018, after years of sowing terror and hiding beneath the guise of an ordinary gardener, Bruce McArthur was apprehended. The blinding glare of police car floodlights, the piercing wail of sirens, and the stern faces of investigators shattered the false silence he had so carefully maintained. The final mask was torn away, revealing the true face of a monster. The arrest took place at McArthur's apartment in Thorncliffe Park, an unremarkable high-rise building. Police had been tracking him for some time, gathering evidence and piecing together clues from the mysterious disappearances within the gay male community. They had reason to believe McArthur was holding another man hostage in his apartment, a potential next victim. The decision to raid was made with urgency. When the door burst open, McArthur may not have been entirely surprised, but he was undoubtedly panicked. The confidence of a predator vanished, replaced by the fear of a beast cornered inside. Police found a man tied to the bed, mercifully still alive, in that moment. Their intervention saved a life, but it also marked the end of a serial killer's reign of freedom. Cold handcuffs clamped tightly around his wrists. The chill of the metal seemed to seep into his very bones, a sensation he had once inflicted on his victims. He was led away through the familiar corridors of the building, under the curious and horrified gazes of neighbors. The man they had known as Bruce, the quiet gardener, was now a cold-blooded killer. The contrast was too vast, too unbelievable. Yet, being caught, shocking as it was not the most terrifying prospect for McArthur in the days that followed, as he sat in a frigid cell, facing 4 silent walls. A different fear began to rise, one far more dreadful than the bars of his prison. It was the shadow in the night, the images, sounds, and guilt he had long suppressed, now surging back with unrelenting force. No longer able to hide in gardens or distract himself with work, McArthur was forced to confront himself and the atrocities he had committed in the solitude of his cell. The faces of his victims haunted him in fitful sleep. Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Soroush Mahmoudi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowik, Selim Esen, Andrew Kinsman, 8 names, 8 lives he had brutally stolen. Their cries, their final gazes, those moments of horror returned, tormenting his mind without cease. The shadow in the night was not merely the specter of his victims, it was the embodiment of his own cruelty, the emptiness of his soul, staring into the darkness. He saw the monster he had become. No mask could shield him now. No lies could delude him. Only the raw, repulsive truth remained. The silence of the prison was not peace. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, thick with the mute screams of the past. Prayers, if they flickered through his mind, were meaningless. What could he pray for? Forgiveness. After all he had done, even he could not forgive himself. As the legal system prepared for trial, gathering more evidence, searching his apartment and the gardens where he had worked, uncovering body parts hidden with barbaric precision. MacArthur faced another trial, one within his rotting soul. In this court, there was no defense attorney, no mercy, only the verdict of his conscience, if even a faint glimmer of it remained. The shadow in the night grew larger, engulfing him. It was not a specific supernatural force, but a culmination of his sins, belated remorse, and self-loathing. For years, he had tried to outrun it, but now there was nowhere left to hide. He was captured by the police, but he was also imprisoned by the ghosts of his own making. The battle against these specters was likely more terrifying than any punishment the law could impose. The only light in his cell was the cold glow of an electric bulb, powerless to dispel the ever-thickening darkness consuming the soul of a killer. On the day of the trial, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. The courtroom was packed families and friends of the victims, carrying in their hearts an inconsolable pain and a thirst for justice. The media, news hounds chasing every detail of one of the most gruesome cases in Canadian history, and ordinary citizens, curious and horrified by the brutality of humanity to the outside world. This was a criminal trial, where the law would judge the crimes of Bruce MacArthur. But in the mind of the killer, or perhaps in the deepest recesses of his subconscious that he tried to deny, this trial carried a different hue, a deeper significance. It was akin to a spiritual judgment, where not only his actions were brought to light, but the dark soul of the man himself was laid bare. MacArthur entered the courtroom, his appearance haggard, aged beyond the images of him from before. The mask of the kindly gardener had vanished entirely, leaving only a man burdened by undeniable guilt. Camera flashes flickered relentlessly. Whispers of discussion filled the air, but he seemed oblivious. His gaze, perhaps cast downward, avoided the furious, pained, and curious eyes fixed upon him. As the charges were read, each victim's name echoed through the hushed room, each one striking like a hammer blow. Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Soroush Mahmoudi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowik, Selim Esen, Andrew Kinsman. 8 lives, 8 futures destroyed, 8 families shattered. The dry language of the law could never capture the full horror of what had transpired. The evidence was presented, cold and merciless. Crime scene photos, details of how MacArthur lured, subdued, killed, and dismembered his victims. The perverse keepsakes he retained from each, like trophies of a ruthless predator. The contrast between the beautiful gardens where he worked and what lay beneath the fertile soil, human remains hidden in grotesque secrecy, sent shivers through the courtroom. Blood and tears, 2 things that should never mingle, now coexisted in agonizing clarity. For MacArthur, each testimony, each piece of evidence, was likely not just a legal recounting of his crimes, but an exposure of the darkest corners of his soul. He may have tried to suppress his emotions, maintaining a stoic facade, but within, a storm was surely raging. The specters he glimpsed in the shadows of his cell at night now seemed to materialize in the courtroom, invisible eyes boring into him, demanding an explanation, a shred of remorse. The judge, in a solemn black robe, resembled a supreme arbiter of justice, not only of the law, but of some moral order. His words, though grounded in legal statutes, carried the weight of a final reckoning. Each syllable struck like a hammer against MacArthur's silent conscience. Perhaps in those moments, MacArthur fleetingly thought of God, of some supernatural force he might have once believed in or long since rejected. This trial, with its solemnity and rituals, bore a faint resemblance to a religious ceremony, a final judgment. The light of justice illuminated his actions, but it also pierced through his perverse motives, his deviant desires, and the emptiness that led him down this path of sin. He could no longer escape. No lies could shield him. The truth was laid bare, raw and repugnant, and that truth condemned him not only before the law, but before whatever remnants of humanity lingered within him. When the verdict was delivered, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, it was not merely the conclusion of a criminal case for MacArthur. It may have marked the beginning of another punishment, one that would stretch through the rest of his days, a sentence of torment, isolation, and confrontation with the demon he had created. The judge's gavel fell, closing the trial, but its echo would likely haunt MacArthur forever, a reminder of a judgment not only by humanity, but by something greater, something he could never fully comprehend, but surely felt the weight of. The spiritual judgment, though unnamed, had taken place, and the sentence was sealed not just on paper, but within the guilty soul of the killer. The prison door slammed shut behind Bruce MacArthur, its harsh, heavy sound marking the end of his life of freedom and the beginning of a new journey, a descent into the darkness of solitude and silent walls. The world outside, with its gardens, familiar streets, and human faces, was now a distant, fading memory. In its place was a brutal reality, a cramped cell, cold concrete walls, and a near absolute silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a guard's footsteps, the creak of iron doors, or the sighs of other imprisoned souls. For many, prison is a place of physical punishment, a stripping away of freedom. But for MacArthur, it likely held a deeper, more terrifying significance. It was a place where he could no longer escape himself. No more gardening to distract him. No more predatory hunts to sate his perverse desires. No more masks to hide behind. There was only him, his crimes, and an all-encompassing silence, a silence with the power to expose everything he had tried to bury. In those first days, the silence was likely the most unbearable. He was accustomed to living a double life, filling the voids with activity and lies. Now, with all of that gone, there was only emptiness, and in that emptiness, echoes from the past began to rise, growing ever clearer. The victims' cries for help, the sobs of their families, the judge's gavel, and even the self-accusing whispers of his own mind. The only light in the cell was a feeble electric bulb, too weak to dispel the darkness in his soul. That darkness was not just the absence of physical light, but a mix of despair, belated remorse, and fear of a future without purpose, a lonely death within these four walls. He might pace the confined space, trying to banish the haunting thoughts, but they clung to him like a shadow. The prison's silence stood in cruel contrast to the sounds of the crimes he had committed. The screams, the struggles, the final gasping breaths, all were now replaced by an eerie stillness. And in that stillness, he could hear, perhaps more clearly, the voice of his conscience, if it still flickered somewhere within, a conscience trampled and ignored for too long, but now, in absolute solitude, beginning to speak in faint, fragile tones. The silent walls became mirrors reflecting his guilt. He looked at them and saw himself a monster who had caused immeasurable suffering. There was no one to talk to, no one to blame, no one to justify himself to. Only the raw, brutal truth remained. Time in prison crawled by, monotonous and slow. Each day mirrored the last, an endless cycle of loneliness and torment. Meals were slid through a slot in the door, and rare moments of exercise in the yard came under strict supervision. Yet even in those moments, MacArthur remained enveloped in his own silence, a silence born of his isolation from the outside world and his confrontation with a chaotic inner one. Perhaps, in that silence, he began to reflect on his life, on the wrong choices, on the turns that led him to this dead end. How had he, a man with a family and a job, spiraled into becoming a serial killer? Could he blame his circumstances, his inner conflicts, his loneliness? Or, in the end, was the responsibility his alone, tied to the choices he made? The silent echoes in the cell were not only of the past, but also of a hopeless future. He knew he would die in prison, never again seeing the light of freedom. That truth, combined with the weight of his guilt, created a crushing pressure, bearing down on his soul. The silence of the prison was a punishment, but perhaps it was also a faint opportunity, a chance to face the truth, to begin a process of repentance. However late, would MacArthur seize that chance, or would he sink further into denial and despair? Only time and he himself could answer that. But one thing was certain: the four silent walls and the enveloping silence would be his inseparable companions for the rest of his days. The long, monotonous days in the cell stretched on, each one a pale copy of the last, steeped in the silence and darkness of solitude. Bruce MacArthur, once a harbinger of terror, was now merely a number in the prison system, a lost soul trapped within four cold walls. He had grown accustomed to the presence of shadows from his past, the silent echoes of his sins. It seemed nothing could pierce the shell of despair and callousness he had built around himself. But then, something unexpected happened. A faint, fragile ray of light broke through the dense darkness of his soul. It was not a grand event, not a miraculous wonder, but something small, ordinary, yet powerful enough to stir the deepest layers of a man who seemed utterly broken. Perhaps it was a letter from a complete stranger, someone who didn't know him, didn't judge his crimes, but simply offered a touch of compassion, a message of forgiveness and hope in a world filled with hatred and condemnation. Such a small act of kindness might have felt like a cool drop of water in a parched desert. MacArthur may have read and reread the letter, puzzling over the writer's motives, and perhaps, for the first time in ages, felt something other than emptiness and guilt. Or maybe the light came from an old, tattered Bible, forgotten in a corner of the cell, or handed to him by another inmate. At first, he might have dismissed it as pointless, a hollow comfort, but in the depths of boredom and despair. One day he opened it. Stories of sin, repentance, mercy, and redemption, things he once mocked or ignored, took on new meaning. They didn't erase his crimes, but they planted a tiny seed of possibility forgiveness, not from people, but from some higher power. If he could truly repent, it could have been a prison chaplain, a kind-hearted soul with boundless patience. This chaplain might not have preached empty dogma, but simply listened to MacArthur, listened to his fragmented confessions, his nameless fears, his endless torment. That non-judgmental listening, that empathetic presence, might have cracked the icy wall MacArthur had built around himself in those conversations. He may have felt, for the first time, seen as a human being, however sinful, rather than a monster. Or, more simply, it could have been another inmate, an unlikely companion carrying their own burden of guilt, but who had found a way to live with it, to seek peace within. A sincere word of advice, a small gesture of care, a story of regret and change might have touched a hidden corner of MacArthur's hardened heart, whatever its source. That ray of light began to spark a change, however slight. In MacArthur, he was no longer entirely consumed by despair. A spark of curiosity, a fragile thread of hope, a vague longing for peace began to take root. He started reading more, reflecting more. Tears, not of self-pity but perhaps of genuine remorse, began to streak his aged face. That light could not erase the darkness of his crimes or ease the pain of his victims and their families, but it opened a path, a possibility, if only for him, to confront what he had done with greater honesty and perhaps to seek some form of redemption for his soul, even as his body faced punishment for life. That lone ray of light was an unexpected gift, a reminder that even in the darkest places, compassion and hope can still exist, and that it is never too late to begin a journey of repentance. However arduous and painful it may be, that fragile ray of light, whether a letter, a Bible, or a fleeting encounter began to stir the stagnant waters of Bruce MacArthur's soul. The silence of his cell was no longer just a terrifying void. It slowly transformed into a space where he could confront himself. The full weight of his sinful life laid bare. The fragments of memory he had desperately suppressed and buried now began to resurface, not as disjointed, chaotic specters haunting him, but as a vivid, cohesive panorama, a slow-motion film of his unstoppable descent. He started to revisit his memories unflinchingly, without excuses. The early signs of disturbance in his childhood, the inner turmoil over his sexual identity, the collapse of his marriage, and the first steel blow that awakened his violent instincts all came into focus. He recalled the warped sense of power he felt when he first inflicted pain, the perverse satisfaction of committing his initial crimes undetected. Light and darkness within him were no longer abstract forces, but concrete choices he had made at every fork in his life's road. Then, the faces of his victims emerged not to torment him with horror, but as painful reminders of the lives he had stolen. Skandaraj Navaratnam, with the friendly smile MacArthur had exploited, Abdul Basir Faizi, a man with unfulfilled hopes, Majid Kayhan, a father and husband who never returned home, Sorush Mahmudi, a young man with a future ahead of him, Krishna Kumar Kanagaratnam, a refugee seeking a better life, Dean Lisowick, a homeless man, vulnerable and exposed, Salim Essen, whose eyes perhaps still held faith in humanity, and Andrew Kinsman, the neighbor, the friend, whose disappearance sounded the final alarm. He remembered every detail of each case, not just the brutal act of murder, but the lies, the deceit, the meticulous planning. He saw himself again a monster in human skin, with cold eyes and a heart devoid of feeling. Their blood seemed to still stain his hands, no matter how many years had passed or how desperately he tried to wash it away. The tears of their families, the anguish of their community, all weighed heavily on his shoulders. This was no longer fear of punishment or vague remorse. It was a stark, unyielding recognition, a direct confrontation with the truth of who he was. He was not a victim of circumstance, not a madman unable to control his actions. He was a deliberate killer, a man who had chosen the path of crime, who had found sick pleasure in spreading suffering and death, in the solitude of his cell, with no one to coerce or interrogate him. A true confession began to take shape in MacArthur's mind, and perhaps, eventually, it found voice, if only in whispers to himself or scrawled words on a scrap of paper. This confession was not for a lighter sentence, or to garner pity. It was an acknowledgement, a full acceptance of responsibility for his deeds. I did it. I killed them. It's all my fault. Simple words, yet laden with the weight of a lifetime of sin. Each confession was a knife plunged into his hardened conscience, inflicting unnecessary searing pain. Tears may have fallen not of self-pity, but of belated remorse, of disgust at himself. This process of reckoning and confession was not a fleeting moment. It was a prolonged, agonizing internal struggle. At times, he wanted to turn away, to deny, to find some excuse to justify himself. But that fragile light, however faint, persisted, urging him to keep facing the truth. If he ever had the chance to see photos of his victims through newspapers or case files, he no longer viewed them as prey, as objects to sate his depravity. He saw them as people, with lives, dreams, and relationships he had utterly destroyed. This realization, though late, was a crucial step toward repentance. The blood-soaked memories were no longer random nightmares. They became part of his penance, a constant reminder of the cost of his crimes. The confession, even if only to himself, was the first step toward shedding the burden of deceit and denial. The road ahead remained long and dark, but at least he had begun to face it honestly. After endless days submerged in blood-soaked memories, after the true confession spoken, if only to himself. From the depths of his soul, Bruce MacArthur sensed a subtle shift. The crushing weight of guilt remained, heavy and unyielding, but something had changed. The desolate emptiness began to give way to a new emotion, one he had nearly forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, a fierce longing to connect with something greater, a fragile belief in the possibility of forgiveness, not from humanity, but from some divine presence. The worn Bible, the pastor's counsel, the words in a stranger's letter, these were no longer meaningless sounds or images. They began to seep into his mind, planting seeds of faith in his heart. He read not to pass the time or seek shallow comfort, but to find answers, a way out for his tormented soul. And then, one day, in the absolute solitude of his cell, Bruce MacArthur did something he had likely never done with sincerity in his entire life. He prayed. It was not a rote prayer, memorized from childhood, nor a deceitful plea to mask dark intentions. It was a prayer born from the abyss of his soul, a desperate cry from a shattered spirit. He didn't kneel formally or clasp his hands mechanically. Perhaps he simply sat on the stiff prison bed or leaned against the cold wall, tears streaming down his haggard face. His prayer was likely incoherent, unbound by ritual. It was choked sobs, fragmented whispers, chaotic but honest thoughts. He didn't beg for freedom or a reduced sentence. He knew his crimes were unforgivable in the eyes of the law and humanity. What he sought, perhaps, was peace for his soul, a flicker of light to dispel the darkness engulfing him. God, if you're real, please hear me. The opening words might have been as simple and hesitant as that. He confessed his sins without concealment or justification, recounting his brutal acts, warped thoughts, and lies. He expressed profound remorse, the agony of realizing the horrific consequences he had inflicted on his victims, their families, and his own soul, in that prayer. The victims' faces appeared again, not as haunting specters, but as souls. He begged for forgiveness. Knowing it was impossible, he prayed for their peace, for their families to find solace after unimaginable loss. The cell's silence was no longer terrifying. It became a sacred space where he could unburden himself, where he could commune with an unseen presence. For the first time, he felt he wasn't entirely alone. There was someone listening, though he could neither see nor touch it. Prayer was not a magic cure to erase his sins. It couldn't change the past, but it gave MacArthur a sliver of hope, a belief that even a sinner like him could find a path to repentance, to atonement, if only in his mind. After that first prayer, he might have felt a vague relief, a tranquility he had never known. It wasn't joy or happiness, but a fragile peace, born of accepting the truth and opening his heart to a new faith. He continued to pray daily, not as a habit, but as a soul's necessity. His prayers evolved over time from confessions and pleas for forgiveness to requests for strength to face his remaining days in prison, and perhaps even for the salvation of his soul after death. Light and darkness still coexisted within him, but now, in the darkness, a candle had been lit small, yet enough to guide a lost soul toward redemption. The prayer from the abyss marked the most profound turning point in Bruce MacArthur's spiritual journey, a shift that couldn't erase his past, but could lend a trace of meaning to the final days of a killer's life. The years slipped by quietly within the gray confines of the prison's four walls. Bruce MacArthur, now a frail old man, bore the weight of age and unforgivable sins. His health deteriorated, physical pains tormenting him, but the deepest agony remained the ache in his soul, though it had been somewhat soothed by belated prayers and repentance. He was no longer the ferocious monster of old. Time, solitude, and introspection had eroded his brutality, leaving a quiet, reserved man who seemed to have accepted his fate. The gardener's mask had shattered long ago, and now no other disguise remained. Only a raw, exposed Bruce MacArthur faced the final days of his life. In these months, memories of his crimes still surfaced, but they were no longer the terrifying nightmares of before. They were like old scars, reminders of an unchangeable past, but also evidence of a late, imperfect journey of atonement. He continued to pray, his prayers now perhaps shorter, quieter, like intimate conversations with a divine presence he had found in his years of confinement. The faint glow of his candle of faith still flickered, illuminating the last dark corners of his soul. He didn't expect forgiveness from the outside world. He knew that was impossible, but he hoped for some measure of mercy in another realm, a peace for his soul after shedding the burdens of this world. Then one day, MacArthur's breaths grew faint. Death came to him not with fanfare or drama, but as silently as his final years in prison. He lay on a simple infirmary bed in the prison's medical ward. Alone. No family stood by, no friends bid farewell. Only the mute walls surrounded him, and perhaps a pastor who had walked with him through the final stages of his repentant journey. In his last moments. As consciousness faded, MacArthur might have seen something, not the haunting faces of his victims, nor the darkness of damnation. Perhaps it was a faint light, a fragile sense of peace, a serene acceptance. He had paid for his crimes with the rest of his life in prison, and, perhaps, with the unrelenting torment of his soul, death arrived, bringing release from physical pain and the weight of guilt. A life steeped in darkness, violence, and deceit came to an end. No one mourned him, but perhaps, somewhere, the souls he had harmed sensed a subtle shift. MacArthur's death was a solitary conclusion, yet not entirely hopeless. In his final years, he had found a path, however thorny, to confront the truth, to repent, and to pray. Whether that was enough to redeem his soul, no one can know. But perhaps a fragile peace touched him in his final breath, as it left his body. The prison's darkness had enveloped him for years, but as he closed his eyes, he may have glimpsed a different light, a light of endings, and perhaps of a new beginning in some distant place free of sin and suffering. The story of Bruce MacArthur, the serial killer cloaked as a gardener, closed with his lonely death in prison. The pace of the tale slows. The images of blood and violence fade, giving way to a quiet space, a meditation on human nature, crime and punishment, repentance and faith. The gardens he once tended, which hid horrific secrets, have likely been restored, their purity reclaimed. Sunlight still bathes them, nurturing new life, a reminder that life persists despite the shadows that once loomed. His victims, those souls unjustly robbed of life, have perhaps found rest. The pain of their families may never fully fade, but justice, though delayed, was served. MacArthur's story is a warning of the hidden darkness in society, of humanity's capacity for unimaginable cruelty. Yet it also offers a faint glimmer of hope that even in the most desperate circumstances, a person can confront their sins and seek repentance. Silence now envelops all the silence of graves, of prison walls, and of a story that has reached its end. Only the lessons remain, the reflections, and perhaps a trace of peace in knowing the monster is gone.